Welcome back. We're discussing the fallout of the latest in the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. For more insight, we're joined now by veteran U.S. diplomat Thomas Pickering. Ambassador Pickering served as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and 6 countries, including Israel and Jordan. Ambassador, thanks for joining us. It has been something like 23 years since the peace process began in Madrid in 1991, and here we are again, more than 2 decades later, at a standstill. Are you optimistic that this is going to go anywhere?
21 years is only the latest phase, my friend. I hope it began way back in 1948 when the State of Israel was established and the ceasefire lines were drawn. But I wish I could be more hopeful. It appears that Secretary Kerry made a really heroic effort to bring things together. At the end, it just seemed to be in the too hard category to bring the two leaders together. My sense is that, unfortunately, this process depends as much on the leaders as it does on anything else. And there are people who are around who believe that they can confect an eminently fair and reasonable peace proposal. The difficulty has been that neither leader on either side is yet ready to pick up entirely what's put forward, or even worse, to engage in the kind of give-and-take negotiations that we've seen in the past to reach peace treaties between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan. So we're not yet in that stage, and it is difficult. It is interesting to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu, despite his aversion to the peace process apparently, and despite the fact that he is teamed in his coalition with many people who are much less enthusiastic than he is, has developed over the years, perhaps put it this way, the cachet, not to be another Rabin, but to be another candidate for a Nixon in China moment, interestingly enough. And I think that's very important. I think that the Palestinian president, from seeming to be a fairly weak individual, is now coming on strong with his announcement on the Holocaust. I think that the question of unity between Hamas and al-Fatah was always there. Whether they took this opportunity now to send some new message, that message was not helpful, as we saw yesterday, even though the Palestinians are insisting that this is only a domestic coalition, that Fatah will do the negotiations.
But shouldn't that reconciliation effort by the Palestinians be seen as a step forward rather than as a setback?
If you accept, and I think there are questions about doing so, but if you accept Prime Minister Netanyahu's judgment that they're on the American terrorist list, that they have practiced terrorism, then it's hard, particularly to bridge the gap where we have said that they have to accept what's been negotiated, accept Israel, and accept to continue without violence as a basis for going ahead. It's perhaps possible to squeeze into that pattern. I was ambassador in Israel in 1987. When the PLO was brought into the negotiations by the United States. Israel hadn't yet accepted them, but the U.S. had, because we felt they met our criteria. Over a period of time, they came in. Over a period of time, these principled objections on the part of others outside brought them in. The real problem is it took quite a bit of time to see that happen. Will Hamas come in and join the negotiations? Hamas has said itself it doesn't want to participate in the negotiations, but it has said on numerous occasions it's willing to let Fatah negotiate, and it's willing to let Fatah, whatever it agrees, put it before the Palestinian people in some kind of referendum. Right. Details are not yet clear. But if the Palestinian people accept it, they will go along. So it isn't exactly a door closed to some of the issues.
Because I'm just wondering, isn't it better from the Israeli point of view to have Hamas being part of this agreement? Then you have an inclusive agreement. They are also bound by whatever the terms of the agreement are.
Perfectly splendid, but of course the Israeli point of view is they'd like to have a partner in Gaza who is a little more, put it this way, a little closer to their own objectives for a pliable or convenient or a negotiating partner, whatever stand you want to take on that. So I think the problem with your conclusion is that they never thought Hamas was an ideal partner under any circumstances. Not even that. They never thought that there was a partner. However, in fact, the reality is, so far, Hamas seems to enjoy popularity. It's declining, I understand, but it seems to enjoy popularity. But Hamas has not been able to control some of the more violent elements in Gaza. To some extent, Hamas has now become Israel's put it this way, security provider from Gaza. Even though it's not able to provide all of that, it's apparent that Hamas has worked hard on some occasions to stop rocket attacks rather than necessarily instituted them.
Well, it does give the hardliners a ready excuse not to enter negotiations.
Yeah.
Is it still your view that the bottom line in this peace process, whether it's going to resume soon or whether it's going to take place later, is a two-state solution based very broadly along the 67 borders?
I think it is, and I say that with a great deal of care because a number of very thoughtful people have fallen back on other approaches. The real problem with other approaches is, in my view, they are, generally speaking, either impossible of achievement or so negative to one party or the other that you won't ever get them, to put it this way, to negotiate at the table reasonably about those approaches. So despite the fact that the two-state solution there may be objections to the two-state solution, and it may cause difficulties, it is, as Winston Churchill used to say about democracy, the least worst of all possibilities.
When we look at the role of the United States, as you pointed out, Secretary Kerry has made a heroic effort to try and get these two sides to come to some kind of agreement, to even come to the table at some stage. But is the United States in some ways reluctant to act because of domestic concerns?
Well, there's no question. Well, that traditionally comes up. And it traditionally comes up to say that the Jewish community is enormously powerful in the United States. And I think they are. But I think that in many ways, people overlook the fact that at least the polling data shows the Jewish community generally votes above 60% for Democrats. So the power is, in my view, less perhaps in the voting strength or the voting results than it is necessarily in the financial contributions. And one would have to look at this a little more carefully. But it is true that a number of very prominent people who happen to be Jews happen to make contributions which are very large to political goals and political objectives, many of whom are very ardent supporters of Israel. Not only that, they're ardent supporters of the present government of Israel, and perhaps one of the most conservative Israeli governments that we have seen in the history of the country, certainly ranking up there with Prime Minister Begin, who himself took opportunities for peace. So it isn't all that clear-cut and that straightforward. One has to.
He wasn't exactly a raving liberal
either.
No,
he was not. No.
Right. Is the next step for the United States to perhaps start some kind of negotiations with Hamas, get Hamas to renounce violence, to recognize the state of Israel, to say, we will bring you back into the fold if you do these things, if you enter into these negotiations? I
would say probably not. I think that is negotiating over a narrow cul-de-sac when the main highway stretches out before us. And so my view is that we should, in fact, do everything we can to look at the options coming down the road. One option is to take advantage of the opportunity to bring the parties together for another period of time, whether it's 5 weeks or 5 months, and see what we can accomplish. Another, which is an impossible option, is to abandon entirely the whole question. We all know that that leads to further frustration, to potential for conflict, and to no direction at all. And so the third is not to try to recalibrate, put it this way, a potential second party in the negotiation. It is in many ways to build on what Abu Mazen and what Secretary Kerry and what Prime Minister Netanyahu have achieved. My view is that if we're stuck now, one option that needs to be considered is whether a framework couldn't be published by the United States, whether it would not be a good idea to do that. Whether, if that is published...
Well, Secretary Kerry has been indicating that he might do that.
He did. He said it. And that's why I say this. But I think the second stage will be harder for the U.S., but it's something we should look at. Whether, if we really believe that this is the right framework, and it is a solid and balanced framework that should appeal to both sides, despite the fact that it has some bitter herbs in it
right.
for each side to drink, why not take it to the UN Security Council? Okay. UN Security Council has now a very ambiguous basis for negotiations, 242. 338 is essentially a process resolution. Right. But if we had another resolution, 2000, whatever it is, X, and that other resolution set a framework that framework would be enormously useful, and it wouldn't waste Secretary Kerry's work.
Right.
It would do two things. It would rule out any U.S. and international support for things that were beyond the framework, which is a real problem now, because each side approaches the negotiation to get its favorite hobby horse accepted by the other side. But the other thing it would do, while it would leave everything open to negotiations, it would frame the negotiations in a channel that had a reasonable prospect for success, and a channel which the U.S. and others, particularly if it goes to the Security Council, were willing fully and internationally to support. And my view, that's been missing. But I said at the beginning, it's the people, not the process or indeed the positions, that are the most important here.
You could get called back into business, Ambassador.
Well, it's been a long time since I've been there.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your insights. When we come back, we'll talk with a former spokesperson to the PLO and a 25-year veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.